Okay, great. So the first thing I want you to notice that you're on your paperwork is that you got a page at the top of it. It says Belial or Beliar, depending on how you say it. It goes with your chapter 2 information, not chapter 3, so put it in with your chapter 2. It was on top of your actual package today. And the reason why I gave you that was I meant to give it to you last week, and it is kind of interesting. I wanted you to have it in your book, is that this is the term which Elias's sons is called. When we get to that question, we'll spend a little bit of time talking about that, but I want you to make sure that you know it goes with chapter 2. All right, so having said that, let's pull out the chapter 2 questions. And we'll do that. So let's see. I'll start with Mom. You'll be number 1 today.
Okay.
And everybody got questions for 1 Samuel chapter 2. Here we go. Number 1. Hannah's prayer is sometimes called the Song of Hannah. We mentioned 3 main sections of the prayer. She praises her
Lord.
Okay, and what he will do both in the present and
in the future.
In the future. Good.
Excuse me, did you say song or psalm?
Song, S-O-N-G, Song of Hannah. Because it was written in Hebrew poetry, more or less, is why it is. It could be set to music. It could be, it was considered, that was the type of singing that was done during that time. The Psalms were also sung, at a future date. So my question would be to you, Mom, do you remember the 3 main sections of the prayer that we talked about?
Let me look at my look at it here and see if it comes to me.
I didn't say that.
Well, it just says we mentioned 3 main sections of the prayer in our question, and so I wanted to make sure that we had that information. Do you remember them?
I do not.
Does anyone have that? Yep.
Joy, praise, and thanksgiving.
Okay. Those are perfect. Anyone else have anything? Well, what we actually, when we broke them down in the teaching, we talked about that the first section through 1 and 2 was a discussion on the God of Hannah. So she spends a lot of time talking about the God of Hannah. The second part of it, which would be 3 through 7, we talked about the disposition of all things. So she's talking about all the things that God has control of. And then the last part of it, which would be 8 through, I've written over the top of it, 10, is actually talking about a future kingdom. The prophecy and promises of a future kingdom. And those are important because if you don't recognize that these things are broken down into certain segments and you think it's all written about one thing, it can get really confusing.
Could you give us me again that?
So the first one is the section is 1 and 2, and that's the God of Hannah. 3 through 7 is the disposition of all things, or how God handles all things. And then 8 through 10 is the future kingdom, or God's sovereignty that's coming in the future. And so we need to recognize that she's sort of hitting all areas of God's power and authority in that, which is what makes it such a powerful song, which is what I think it's our next prayer. I'm gonna leave number 2 for that. So number 2, so that would be Marianne. Hannah's prayer is so similar to another prayer in Scripture. Whose and where does that found? Go ahead.
After the angel speaks to her and tells her she's going to have the child Jesus.
Good. And we find that in anybody?
Luke 1.
Good. Luke chapter 1 starts later.
Through 55.
46 through 55. And so that's, and Mary really frames her song or praise very much after Hannah's. Mm-hmm. So you'll see a lot of similarities there. All right, number 3. What do we find out about Eli's 2 adult sons, Hophni and Phinehas, in verse 12? Sherry?
Now the sons of Eli were corrupt, worthless, unregenerate. They did not know the Lord.
Good. Corrupt, worthless, unregenerate. This is where you're going to want to stick that piece of paper that I gave you, sons of Belial, which is very interesting. All this information on here is something that you can read this week. But what it is it is a Hebrew adjective word meaning worthless, lacking worth, without value. It's a phrase that is actually becomes what we know as Beelzebub or Satan. It's another form of that. And we see it used a couple of different times in the Bible. This will tell you some of the information. When men do particularly wicked things, this term is used. We translate it as worthless. In the Hebrew, they are called the sons of Belial. So that is to show that they come from Satan. So it made me think of, in prophetic word in the New Testament, we talk about the Antichrist being the son of lawlessness. And it's that whole sort of phraseology there on these people that are without worth, without value. And all the things that you said, worthless, without value, unregenerate, just kind of feeds into that. I almost wish they would leave it in the Hebrew term because it's really more powerful than just saying they were corrupt. Yeah, they were corrupt all right, but they were corrupt in a whole new level. We'll find some more about that.
And the main emphasis on that one is that they did not know the Lord.
Exactly. They did not know the Lord, which is why the term unregenerate fits so beautifully, because although they were doing all of the things that priests should do, they did not know the Lord. And so everything they did had no value, right? It would be, it had no value in the works, even though every day, every part of their day, the hours of their day would be spent doing this type of work that a priest would do. But it had no value. Doesn't that, bring it up to today's world, and you look at, the horrible scandals that have occurred in the Catholic Church with their leadership, in the priesthood of their church, in the Protestant church with the pastors in these horrible scandals, the Jim Baker thing and the different ones that you read about on and see on TV, and you think to yourself, sometimes people just get caught up in sin, it's true, but other times you wonder, do they ever know the Lord? They're working every day, they're in ministry, but do they ever know the Lord? And of course, we can do the same, right? It's not just leadership that has that. It can be any person. There are people who spend their whole life doing service for the Lord, and you might wonder, do they really know the Lord? What would make you think that? If they're working 8, 10, 12 hours a day doing ministry, what would make you think?
Their actions.
Their actions?
Fruit.
The fruit. The heart, right? How is the heart revealed in people? You can do a lot of work, and if you do it with a cranky attitude and you're snarky about it and you don't have the love of the Lord, then what you're doing is done in vain. It is. That's a terrible thing. Sometimes I know with our, us raising our kids and stuff, you get to the point where you're just like up to here. But once you turn loose of that, then your work is in vain. And so we need to remember that it's always that heart matter that's important. And so we see that really strongly in this chapter. All right, let's go to number 4. That would be you, Debbie. What terrible things did they do? And this would be Hophni and Phinehas. And what made it so terrible?
They would take the offering for themselves.
Yep.
And in doing that, they were robbing God, and they were also robbing the people
That's right.
of being able to make their offering to God, and also of having their communal meal and fellowship.
That's exactly right. So they were stealing, weren't they? They were stealing from God. And how were they stealing from God?
Taking more than they should.
No. How were they stealing from God? Anybody? The
Well,
fat.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
right.
That was
What was
particularly.
the fat and the blood?
The fat and the blood were the two things that were God's. Here they're particularly talking about the fat, which they took And so that was considered robbing God, because that was not something that they would ever consume or eat. Neither the priest nor the offerer would ever eat that. But God, that was God's. And so they were stealing from God when they took the fat. And then they were stealing from each other, right? When they would go in, it says with that little fork, and what did they do?
3-pronged fish hook.
There you go.
Take the best.
Take it in there, stick it in there, and bring up as much as they could bring up, is the way that they would traditionally do it. But these guys were coming in there and wanting even more than what they had. And they were also, if you remember us talking about, they were asking for it raw. We talked about why. Why would they ask for it raw? Well, they would ask for it raw. One of the reasons may potentially be that people, that may potentially be that that it just tasted better. And so they might want to do it their own way rather than the way they should. And secondarily, if it's raw, they can also sell it and make money off of raw meat that's not already cooked, and people can do whatever they want to do with it. It doesn't matter really what they were doing with it. We know it was nefarious, right? It was not what God had planned for them. And so
and they wanted the fat,
mhm.
and they had always known it wasn't just in this particular case.
Right.
They had always known that the fat belonged to the Lord.
Right, exactly. And particularly because they're priests. They're very well versed on all of that. So they have no reason not to understand. So they were willingly and knowingly going in and taking what was God's. It's just, I mean, boy, that's just so nervy. The only thing I can think of is I remember at Calvary twice during a pretty close together period of time, someone busted the glass doors out and robbed the offering box. And I thought to myself, it's terrible to steal from anybody. But to break the glass out and rob the offering from God, that is just so nervy. Don't you think? I mean, that just takes a whole new set.
For my handicapped person.
It just takes, well, I mean, when you're robbing from God, that's pretty bad. That's as bad as it
And
gets.
you know
That's
they
right.
had been taught that all of their life.
That there was
That had
yeah,
come from way before them.
yeah, absolutely.
Talks about for men abhorred the offering of the Lord.
Yeah, despised, right?
Mhm.
And abhorred the offerings of the
Can
Lord.
I ask, I always pictured the fish hook looking like an anchor.
Uh-huh.
You know, not a fork.
It's actually a 3-pronged fork that's
Okay.
used.
Okay.
So it would be similar. I don't remember how many tins are on our forks today, but it would be something similar, only larger.
Okay.
So, but it is specifically called a 3-pronged fork
Okay.
that they would stick in and
Yeah,
pull
I
out
always
of.
thought it was.
It might have had barbs on the
It could have had barbs on the end, or it could have been hooked to a point. It wouldn't have to be straight. So, you know, it could be. All right, number 5. What item did Samuel wear? Was that normal or unusual? And explain.
He wore a linen ephod,
Okay.
and that would be unusual because only the priests were allowed to wear those, the linen.
The priests were allowed to wear that. Yes. So, okay. All right. I see where you're going with that. It was a linen ephod, and the priests were allowed to wear that. Now, let's just kind of expand on that a bit. What priests were allowed to wear the linen ephod?
Serving priests.
There you go. The serving priests. So all the priests were allowed to wear a linen ephod. The high priest wore something different. What did he wear?
The breastplate.
He wore the jeweled ephod, right? The gold ephod with the breastplate on it. And if you remember from our Exodus, it had the stones of the tribes of Israel, plus pockets for the Urim and the Thummim. We talked about that, the little stones of decision that they used. And so that only the high priest could wear that jeweled type of ephod. But all of the serving priests would wear the linen ephods. And what's really interesting is that when the high priest would go in on the Day of Atonement into the Holy of Holies to where the Ark of the Covenant was, the mercy seat, where the cherubim over the mercy seat, when he would go in once a year and make that offering, all of that gold and jeweled breastplate and everything was off. And he was back down to the linen ephod that all of the priests wore at that time. God wanted his high priest to represent himself in a very beautiful and consecrated, set-apart way. But when man came to God, it was in the simplest, purest form of the linen ephod, and that was all that he wore when he went in to do that. So it's just kind of an interesting thing. So we talked last week about Samuel having the little small, I keep doing that, don't I? The little small ephod that he had, that would make him be wearing what all of the priests during that time, not necessarily the high priests or not, but those who were just serving would have that. Yes,
But
Mary.
the priests didn't start being priests until they were 30.
That's exactly right. But remember, we discussed the fact that Samuel was consecrated from birth. And so when she gives Samuel to him, he's in a different category. He's and he's working in priestly duties. And is Samuel from the tribe of Levi?
Yes.
Yes, he's a Levite, isn't he? And so he is working in priestly duties, wearing the linen ephod primarily, and we're going to see him in this next chapter step into his role at a very early age. So the fact that he's doing that doesn't seem, it seems, I guess the reason why I hesitated when Ramona answered that is because it does seem unusual, because here he is a child doing that, wearing it but it doesn't seem unusual in the fact that all of the priests who were serving and working during that time, and we're going to see some of the jobs that Samuel did today, they were definitely priestly jobs that he was out there doing, and so he did that.
And then in Ezekiel, we learned that in the future temple, they have to take those robes off as soon as they're not serving.
That's right.
And so it's an on and off.
That's right. God is very specific. If you go back to Exodus and read about the ephods and the follow-up in Leviticus, and you read about that information, God is very specific on what he wants it to look like. The material that it's to be made of, what it is to look like, who wears what, and it's very important to God that things be done in a certain way. He gives the instruction on the high priest on the Day of Atonement. He changes his, I don't want to say costume, his outfit, uniform, whatever it is. Garments, there you go, that's better. He changes it multiple times throughout the day. I think right off the top of my head, and I could be wrong, I think it's 4 times he changes his garments during that time frame. He had an overgarment too, and so there's a lot, and God's very specific about what people wear when. And we've talked about that before. We talked about that in Ezekiel, modesty, when he was talking about the immodest behavior of people that were working around the temple area, and we talked about the fact that's important to God. How people present themselves. It's not that it has to be fancy. It's that God has certain stipulations, modesty being one of them, and in this case, linen. It needed to be that particular material was very important. God has very specific instructions that materials not blend, that 2 types of materials not be blended together to create a third. It needed to be natural, the way that it would come, not something that's created by blending together 2 materials. So all the clothes we all have on today, not kosher at all. All right, number 6. What did Hannah do each year?
She brought a new linen robe to Samuel as he grew up to Shiloh, to the tabernacle.
Okay, she brought, and the word that was, she made it. Each year she came, and it doesn't say that it was linen. It says that it was an outer garment is the word that was used. So it was an outer garment. Now, there are many people who teach that this linen ephod is the same as what Hannah brings. In fact, I was doing a reading of a guy that I really like to read a lot of and really trust his writing. And today, and he was talking about the linen, she brings the linen ephod to him. But if you take it back to the Hebrew, it's not the same word. It's an outer garment that she made for him. We would call it a coat or cloak that she brings up for him to keep him warm.
It said robe.
And it's an outer garment. And so the way that it's translated in English can lead to some, if you're not careful, you might not know exactly what it is. But an outer garment and a linen ephod are not the same garment. It's not worth fighting with anybody about. It's just interesting to tuck away for information that you might want to know. So she's making an outer garment, like Cindy said, bringing it every year up to him and presenting it to him so that he has that. I can only imagine the amount of joy as she's making that garment for her Samuel.
Kind of relates to Joseph.
It does, doesn't it? That outer garment's kind of special idea. But I just think that it must have given her a lot of joy. And it also tells us that at least we know that Samuel had regular contact with his family at least once a year. I don't know if there was any other, but at least once a year when they came up, she brought that and they had regular contact. So he knew his mom and dad, and he knew he was part of their life for that. All right, number 7, God provided great blessing in the life of Hannah. How do we see that? Mom?
He blessed her with five more children.
Yeah.
3 boys and 2 girls.
3 boys and 2 girls. So with Samuel thrown in the mixture, we know that Hannah had 6 children. And the lesson learned here is that you can never, what? Outgive God. All right. We talked last week about the fact that God is never a debtor to us. So that's kind of a cool lesson. She was perfectly happy, wasn't she? What did she ask for?
1 child.
I want a male child, and I'll give him back to you. You know, I'll give him to you.
And that also applies in our lives. Many times the things we ask for, we get a lot more than we ask for.
That's true. That's exactly true. You can't outgive God, and He is never a debtor to us. And she was not only thrilled with Samuel, and that was the prayer. I mean, we just read that praise that she gave for Samuel, even though she was, turning him over to Eli, and God gives her 5 more. So that's a beautiful little exclamation point to that. All right, number 8. Verse 22 gives us another sin that was committed by Eli's sons. What was that other sin? Bonnie, we'll go back to you.
I wasn't here.
Oh, that's right. I'm sorry. Whoever's next, that would be you, Marianne.
Fornication with women who assembled at the door of the tabernacle.
Okay. So sexual immorality. So fornication with the women, absolutely. If you want to be more specific, adultery, because they're married. And so they're both.
That's what I was wondering. Who were
Yes.
the women?
Well,
what was their background?
So the women who would be at the entrance of the tabernacle, there are two possibilities there. One, they could be loose women who chased after priest guys and liked that and allowed this to go on. The other side of the coin could be these are the women who did the work out there, that took care of Samuel when he was very young, who did the laundry and the different jobs that the women handled at that time, and perhaps were forced against their will to partake in that. It's not really, it says that they laid with the women. We know that that's means they had sexual relations with them. We don't know how they had that. So it could be that the women allowed it or that they were forced. Either way, it was wrong. We're going to find out for sure that one of them was married, and 99.9% sure that the second one was married. And so these guys committed fornication with these women, but they were committing adultery also. And so it was a horrible, horrible sin. All right, number 9. What did their sin cause for the people?
Says you make the Lord's people transgress.
That's right.
Nevertheless, they did not heed the voice of their father, because the Lord desired to kill them.
Okay, so he made the people what? What their actions made the people sin. They caused, so the very people who had been given the responsibility to care for the spiritual lives of their people were the ones who were causing them to sin. That's why there are books. I have 2 in my library that have the title like Churches That Abuse.
Mm-hmm.
The wounding of the flock. Those books are out there. If a person needed to get them, they're out there being written because people have experienced that. And it's the very people who are in charge of the shepherding that are causing the people to sin and transgress. All those famous people that we know their horrible stories, those priests who are in charge of, what is a priest in charge of? A parish. That are in charge of the parish, they're causing their people to sin. And so God holds that to a whole different standard.
Was it bring him into judgment, into another level of?
We're going to find out in this week's chapter. Oh, yes, it brings them into another level. Because God always, the more authority that you have in any area, the more God, the expectation from God is the higher the judgment. So it is, it's a really powerful thing to be in any sort of authority. Whatever it is that you're doing, God, you put yourself in a position of, once you take on the power and the authority, you also take on the responsibility of that. And that's how these men, from Eli to both of his sons, that's how they failed in this example. And boy, we see it over and over and over again in Scripture, is that in their rise to power, they failed in all the other areas that God held them accountable. All right, what was number 10? What was Eli's? I'm sorry, what?
Were we supposed to stop there?
Yeah,
Oh, we're supposed to stop there. Good, thank you, Ramona. We didn't get finished with chapter 2, and so number 10 is where we'll pick up for the next time.
Stop at 27.